Well, welcome back to the afternoon session of the Encephalitis conference. It's my pleasure to begin this session by welcoming investigative journalist Brian Deer.
Hello, Ava.
Hi, Brian. Nice to see you again.
Nice to see you as well.
Congratulations on the book, Brian, The Doctor Who Fooled the World, Andrew Wakefield's War on Vaccines, and many thanks for joining us this afternoon.
My pleasure.
I've read the book in detail, and indeed your detail is both exacting and extraordinary at times. It's a really gripping read from cover to cover. Despite the Andrew Wakefield situation being something that has received extraordinary coverage since it began in the early 1990s, the level of detail in your book really brought a deeper understanding for me, and I guess a horror, if I'm honest, but I think that's something that I'll come back to. I know first we're going to start this session of the conference with a short reading from the book. So over to you, Brian, to set the scene for us about the Doctor Who Fooled the World.
Well, thank you, Ava. I can reassure you that I'm only going to read 4 pages, so if you're thinking of popping out for refreshment, now is not the moment. Here we go. I feel I should read this in an American accent, but I'm not going to. I don't think it would help. Okay. On the first night of the Donald Trump presidency, a video went up on the World Wide Web that sent a shudder through medicine and science. It featured a 60-year-old man in a black tie and tuxedo grinning into his phone under blue and white lights from a ballroom in Washington, D.C. "Sorry about that, guys," he says in a mellow British accent that would suit James Bond or a Harry Potter wizard. "I don't know whether people are back on, yeah?" Then he repeats himself. "Sorry about that." Below medium brown hair, his face glistens with sweat. White light flashes on grey eyes. As he talks, he walks, first in brightness, then shadow, pursing full lips as if searching for a thought, then raising a fist to cough. "Just looking round, see if there's anyone important here," he says, unzipping a smirk at his proximity to power. "If I can prevail upon them." The picture is shaky and doesn't last long. 2.5 minutes of sideways turned images streamed live on Periscope, a self-broadcasting app, from that night's most exclusive event. A muffled beat thumps, spotlights blaze, Secret Service agents take up positions. To some of us watching, as I was from London, he looked like the perfect party guest. People once said he was handsome, even hot, with a sportsman's physique, a charismatic charm, and a confidence that led others to trust him. That night, in a wing collar and pre-tied bow, he might have passed for a diplomat, a knighted stage actor, or a retired Major League Baseball star. But to others around the world, his appearance provoked gasps. You'd think the Prince of Darkness had stepped onto the dance floor. For this was Andrew Wakefield, a disgraced former doctor who'd been booted from his profession on charges of fraud, dishonesty, and a callous disregard for children's suffering. "Too much to comprehend," sneered a Texas gastroenterologist in a flurry of Twitter posts fired that night. "I need anti-nausea meds," moaned a chemist in Los Angeles. A Dutch autism researcher, scary times indeed. A Brazilian biologist, an administration for charlatans. And from a PhD student on the North Island of New Zealand, I hoped he'd just crawled under a rock. No chance of that. This man revelled in infamy. His nature and predicament required it. Not since the 1990s and the arrest of one Harold Shipman, who serially murdered 200 of his patients, had a British medical practitioner been so scorned. The New York Times described Wakefield as one of the most reviled doctors of his generation. Time magazine listed him among history's great science frauds, and the Daily News spat that he'd been shamed before the world under the headline, "Hippocrates would puke." His fall wasn't recent or easily missed by Trump's team tasked to check the night's guest list. By now, his disrepute was both acute and chronic, absorbed into popular culture. He'd been drawn as the villain in a cartoon strip, The Facts in the Case of Dr. Andrew Wakefield. Sweated over by students in high school exams, was Dr. Wakefield's report based on reliable scientific evidence, and his name embraced in public conversation as shorthand for one not to be believed. The Andrew Wakefield of biology, the Andrew Wakefield of politics, the Andrew Wakefield of transportation and planning. Yet, here he was at the Liberty Ball on Friday, January 20, 2017, at a little after 7 in the evening. Behind him, on level 2 of the Walter E. Washington Convention Center, the first of the night's revelers to pass through security rustled in their finery towards fluorescent-fronted bars. And Trump would later shuffle here with the First Lady Melania to Frank Sinatra's 1960s classic, My Way. So, very, very exciting times, Wakefield gushed. I wish you could all be here with us. Me too. I think I'll stop there.
Okay, Brian, thank you very much. Thank you. Look, I've got a million questions having read the book, but I'm just going to try and keep it to a few key ones. Let me start. I mean, throughout the book, you often refer to the level of knowledge required to do this type of journalism. I think you refer to it as the ologies in the book. And so as I read the book, I wondered what spurred you to enter this type of investigative journalism, part private detective, part journalist?
Well, I started at the Sunday Times way back in the 1980s as a sub-editor, editing copy, and then one day my bosses in the business section were moved to take over the news department, and I became a newspaper reporter working on Sunday News, which has a 4-day-a-week schedule, and you basically spend 4 days on the story. And I started to get more and more interested in the pharmaceutical industry. And back in 1986, I chased a researcher all around the world who'd faked his research on what was then a new generation of oral contraceptives. And I just got very interested in longer investigations. So then after a long period in news, I left the newsroom and started working on magazine stories, which enabled me to spend up to a year on some stories. I mean, I've done 3 vaccine stories. One took 6 months on the world's first AIDS vaccine, which failed in a phase 3 clinical trial in 2003. I spent a year on the diphtheria, tetanus and pertussis vaccine, which was a subject of a huge public scare in the 1970s and 1980s, which I think most people won't know, won't remember, or weren't around for today. And then years on the MMR shot. And it's just, what kept me on the Wakefield story was in part the fact that he sued us. After the first stories in the Sunday Times, I then did a dispatches program for the Channel 4 network in the UK, and he made the mistake of suing us. It was the judge, even the judge said the lawsuit was for public relations purposes. It wasn't a legitimate lawsuit at all. But in the context of that lawsuit, a great deal of information was disclosed to me by Wakefield's lawyers, and it was quite clear I had to continue. And then there was a disciplinary inquiry by the General Medical Council, the UK's regulator for all doctors, and that went on for 217 days, spread out over 2.5 years. It went on longer than the trial of O.J. Simpson. So that enabled me to ultimately get what I knew from the lawsuit that he brought against me was the truth behind his research claims, because in that General Medical Council hearing, in public, with me the only journalist in the room, they laid out the complete medical records on the children enrolled in Wakefield's now notorious and retracted research of February 1998, which I think a lot of people will have heard of. And in the course of that, I was able, and I think I'm the first, and I may well be the only person who's ever done this. I mean, if anybody out there is aware of anybody who's done this, I'd be interested, because I'd be interested in talking to them or reading if it's a historical case. I'm not aware of anybody else who's ever been able to unmask the facts of the clinical cases, the patient cases behind a clinical case series, because Wakefield's famous research was a clinical case series of 12 children, and I was able to find out the names, the histories, the diagnoses, and what these children did or didn't have, the diagnosis that they were given or the diagnosis they weren't given. I found out everything about these enormously confidential issues lying behind a piece of biomedical research. And if anybody else has ever gone round the back of a piece of biomedical research and got that kind of data on the patients enrolled, I'd be really interested to hear from them, because as far as I know, nobody's ever done it. It was a shocking picture. And one of the things, Ava, I say about my book is a lot of people think I'm kind of preoccupied with vaccines, and I'm not really. I mean, what was interesting to me was what went back to the guy and the contraceptive pill frauds was, and I say it directly in the book with regard to Andrew Wakefield, if he could do what he did, and I show you in the book what he did, who else is doing what in the hospitals and the laboratories that we now look to for our lives? And if as I believe, and I think there's quite a lot of people who've looked into this area believe, there is a great deal of fraud and chiseling of data and deception in biomedical publishing, then that needs to be dealt with. And I kind of sometimes wonder whether people talking about my book might be more productive, or at least as productive, in looking at that aspect of it, as in addition to the whole question about vaccination.
Well, you're clearly still very passionate about it, of course, and you know you've in part, I guess, answered this question. You talk about tracking Andrew Wakefield on and off for over 13 years, and I think in the book you even describe yourself as the Van Helsing to his Count Dracula. You know, other than what you've just touched upon, which was him deciding to sue you, you know. What was it about this story and about Wakefield in particular, other than him suing you, that kept drawing you back?
Well, as I say, no one has ever got behind a piece of biomedical research and found out the truth about the clinical cases, about the pathology, about the virology, the epidemiology, and all the ologies that drive me crazy. And as I did this, I kept saying, you know, I'm definitely not going to do epidemiology, and then along it comes, and molecular biology. I mean, I think there's quite a good description of the polymerase chain reaction, which is now, everyone's been talking about it because it's the basis for a lot of COVID-19 work. But I was kept engaged by, I suppose, the need to get the story out, because his response, if he'd just said at the beginning, okay, I mean, the first revelation we had was a fairly basic one, but which had a huge impact in the British media at the time. Way back in 2004 now, and we showed that his research on these children, in fact, wasn't just an academic doing research at a London hospital, which is how it appeared to be, but in fact he'd been hired to run an attack on the MMR vaccine by a lawyer, and that the children in his study were actually sent to him by an anti-vaccine group. So these children, these patients in this study weren't just patients turning up at a hospital for healthcare. They'd come with their parents because their parents wanted to sue. They wanted to join a lawsuit. So they would blame the MMR vaccine because that's why they'd come. So there was that, and then we went on. Once we did that, I was able then to show that Wakefield's own laboratory had refuted his hypothesis, when his hypothesis was that it was measles virus in the MMR vaccine that was the ultimate culprit for autism and some form of inflammatory bowel disease, which he claimed existed. So we had that. We had the fact that he'd filed for his own patent before he stood up at a press conference and called on parents to boycott the MMR in favour of single vaccines, and he'd taken out his own patent on a vaccine, and it just went on and on. And then eventually we got to unmasking the clinical data in the study. And I don't think it would be would have been responsible of me to just say, oh well, I've had enough of that. I'm sick of this guy. I'm going to walk away. But if he'd said sorry and just apologised for the first stuff and said, well, I didn't realise that my role for a lawyer and the fact that I was being paid to do this work was misunderstood, I think I might have moved on and thought, well, that was that, but he didn't. Okay. He said that I was a liar, he said none of it was true, and so on and so forth. And I think that kept me on his path, really.
Good. Well, look, let's just focus on the children for the moment, because when I started this interview, I talked about a horror that I felt when I read some elements of your book. And the horror I spoke of was in large part when I realised the horrors experienced by the children in the 12-child study on which Wakefield had hung these initial conclusions around autism and its link to MMR vaccine. Indeed, you describe on page 51, I think it is, the study is the most unethical, dishonest and damaging medical research in living memory. So can you just describe for the audience, for us, how these children were recruited, the tests that they underwent, and how the study team managed to get ethical approval for it?
Well, the last point, it's easy. They never got ethical approval for it at all. No hospital ethics committee would have approved what he did. What they did. In my view, these children were assaulted. In my opinion, these children were assaulted, and that those people involved should have faced arrest for what they did, because they didn't have ethical approval for it, and the parents were not capable of giving permission. Parents are not able, as a matter of law, I'm not a lawyer, but it's a matter of law, parents are not able to give permission for their children to be assaulted. I believe that these children were assaulted. These children had a range of developmental issues, or in one case perhaps no developmental issue at all, but they had a range of developmental issues, broadly on the autistic spectrum, most of them. Generally, these tend to be children who don't like to be, they don't like the rhythm of their life disturbed, and they were brought, they were aged between 3 and 9.5, and they were brought from all over 200 miles, some of them, one from California. The nearest to the hospital was 60 miles away, and they were brought in on a Sunday and then kept there till the following Friday. And during that time, they would undergo lumbar puncture, colonoscopies, in fact, ileocolonoscopies, which is intubation all the way to the small intestine, MRI, CT scans, EEGs, blood tests, barium meals. And these children, some of them were fighting back, they were screaming, crying all the time. And one child, a parent who ultimately came to me, one of the parents in the study who came to me and said, I really want you to know what happened. This child actually collapsed 4 times in the hospital, collapsed in corridors, was ultimately sent home 280 miles in a taxi because he was vomiting and in such a bad state. This was a house of horrors, in my view, what happened to these children, and it yielded precisely nothing of use. It produced nothing that helped these children. The evidence of that is they were never invited to come back. There were children who the experience of lumbar puncture meant they were admitted as emergency cases to other hospitals. No, it was a shocking thing, and certainly it should have been made absolutely clear to the hospital authorities what was going on, what the purpose of it was, and the fact that this was a fishing expedition in which Wakefield was trying to prove a hypothesis of his own, which initially was that the measles virus in vaccines caused Crohn's disease, which he believed. We didn't actually find any examples for his paper. And then when he put that forward in the media, he was approached by this lawyer and invited to try and prove that the MMR vaccine caused autism. He stuck with his theory that it was measles virus in the shot. Completely absurd. Nobody thinks that today. And in pursuit of that, he had to get into the guts of these children.
Okay. Well, you talked about the lawyer, and that was going to be one of my next questions. Richard Barr was the lawyer in all of this, and he starts his career, as I understood it from your book, as a jobbing conveyancing lawyer. He miraculously morphs into a vaccine compensation lawyer. As I read the book, I often pondered how much blame or responsibility you think lays at the doors of others. If I asked you to name your top 3 people who, in addition to Wakefield, bear responsibility for what went on, who would they be, and briefly why?
Well, firstly, I would identify Richard Barr, who's already threatened. He threatened to sue the Times over serialisation of my book, but he went away after he got a stiff letter of response. This was a man who, as you say, he was a jobbing solicitor in Norfolk. His big thing was conveyancing, and just somebody on whose house he'd done the conveyancing had approached him about a vaccine-related matter, and he managed to get that in the newspapers and set himself up as the lawyer of choice. He had with him somebody who he called his scientific expert and scientist working on the cases, and he would advertise the cases both to parents and in the media that I've got a scientist and scientific advice. This scientist and this scientific advisor, I discovered years later, had her qualification. She married him, 10 years his junior. She married him a couple of years after she joined his team, after she'd come to him originally as a client. Her qualification as a scientist, and was held out to these parents as a scientist, was that she had a BSc in agriculture. So that was the standard of the scientific expert and the scientist at the heart of this. So you've got a conveyancer, you've got a agriculture graduate. The original case, a parent, was a woman called Rosemary Keswick who came to him making allegations against the vaccine. She'd been referred to him by an anti-vaccine group called JABS. Her background was she had worked in a travel agent, and she supplied much of the medical and scientific theory, having worked in a travel agent, that was put forward in this lawsuit, and which was used to spread this thing all over the world. And then there was a woman called Jackie Fletcher, who ran an organisation called JABS, and whose child was in the early used as a sort of poster boy for vaccine damage. And she, what nobody ever realised, was that she actually was her personal goal was to get as many people as possible to join her and to make allegations against the vaccine, so that she could sue the drug company who made the vaccine. Although in the end, the most persuasive evidence presented in court was that her child never received the MMR vaccine at all, and that in fact the vaccine he was given was a tetanus vaccine, and that the MMR vaccine, for which she'd taken and entered a batch number for this supposed MMR vaccine, was in fact a tetanus vaccine. And so she was behind it all. So you had this ship of fools who were able to launch this thing, which ultimately, in the end, this lawsuit which failed, the combined cost to the legal aid fund, the British taxpayer was paying for this, so this was how the British taxpayer paid to frighten itself. The total cost of what the taxpayer put into this lawsuit, plus what the drug company defendants put into this lawsuit, which failed in late 2003, if you convert it to American dollars and you bring it up to today's prices, there's approximately $100 million went on launching this anxiety over children's vaccines, and which we now see spreading out around the world and in every other aspect of vaccines. $100 million, and it produced precisely nothing of any value.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to ask you one final question before we take a couple of questions from the floor. I've got an audience question here. But before I conclude the interview, I just want to finish with perhaps what I think is the most important element of this, and I think something that you emphasised regularly throughout the book. You remind us of the winners, as you've just described, Wakefield, and among others, the lawyers paid from public funds, while the losers then and now, perhaps, are the families. The untold damage that this has done to the children, their parents, both those in the study and those that followed. And this is something that's clearly important to you. I just wondered if you wanted, as I draw the interview to a close, to say a couple of words about that.
Yeah, I mean, there's been so much preoccupation with people being frightened to vaccinate their children, but to me, the forgotten victims are those people who Wakefield and these people prey on. And these are people who believe, and it was actually my book, and I stopped reading before I got to this, introducing these people who believe it's their own fault for vaccinating their child that their child has a developmental issue. Because it never was those parents telling him. It was always him and Mr. Barr and Miss Keswick and Miss Fletcher. They were the ones who were doing the telling. They were saying to people who didn't know why their child had autism or some other developmental issue, and they were telling those parents, this is what did it. It was vaccination that did it. And to visit on those parents that unwarranted guilt The idea that they'd done it to themselves not only imposes that burden on them, that completely unfair burden on them, but that's what allowed him to use their vulnerability to manipulate them to create the if you like, the cohorts now who are running the websites and the Facebook pages and creating all the hoo-ha about vaccine safety today. So many of them are people who have been tormented by this man into believing it's their own fault that their child has perhaps a life-changing, perhaps even life-destroying developmental issue. And I think that is so, so shocking. And for me, that's the emotional heart of it. And really, I suppose, at a human level, most motivated me to say more about it.
And I think that's a good point on which we'll end. And I think you made the point in your book, if I recall it correctly, which was they could either sit there and fester in their own guilt, or their alternative was to become an activist and join the Wakefield
Blame
plan.
Somebody else.
Yeah.
Blame the government, blame drug
someone else.
companies, whatever.
Well, I could talk to you all day. Obviously, if anybody wants to know more about what's been described as the medical scandal of the century and which played a significant role in the global vaccines crisis today, then do please order a copy of the book. Brian's signing them here today for us. We've got some here and we'll have them posted out to you. I believe we've got a question or two from the floor. We'll take one from here, and then I've got one from the audience further afield. Professor Tom Solomon.
Thanks very much for joining us today. I suppose one critical question today, the first day that a COVID vaccine has been given through the new licence, what are the lessons, and a lot of the same kind of feelings are circulating, what are the lessons, what should we actively be doing to try and make sure that these COVID vaccines are used and that this kind of the anti-vax sentiments of some people don't spill over into impacting on who has COVID vaccines?
Well, I always try to make clear that I'm not a campaigner for vaccination. I don't regard it as being my job as a journalist to tell people whether to vaccinate their children or themselves or take any other product. But what I would say, by way of analysis, is that there have been two things that I've noticed over the years in terms of the DTP thing, the MMR thing, that really make a difference. One is the revelation of truth, so that when people realised that Wakefield was being paid by a firm of lawyers, they got it, they understood what that meant. And when we showed what happened, what he did with the data, people got it, and we saw vaccination rates go right back to where they were before he got involved. And you can relate that directly to the Sunday Times investigation that ultimately, I suppose, my book is derived from. The other thing is that people become aware of infectious disease. Because when people don't vaccinate, you get outbreaks of infectious disease. It's around the other way at the moment. But I think what you'll see is that there will still be people who are apprehensive, reluctant, hesitant. I think it's the word that most people are using. But it's fine. I mean, when you think about it, it's fine for the moment if they hesitate, because you know, at 6:30 this morning, we had a 90-year-old vaccinated in Coventry. Well, that's a good start, and there'll be some more and some more and some more. But it's going to take a long time before all the people who want to be vaccinated have been vaccinated, and we then get to this whole question of who's saying no then. And I think what we'll see is that when people see that vaccination works, assuming it does, when they see that vaccination works and when they've got a sense of the risk-benefit profile of these vaccines, then I think people will come on board. There will always be a certain number who remain hiding in the herd, who are, free riders on everybody else's civic responsibility. And it may well be that people have got ways to get to those. But I have to say it is extremely difficult, and most of the research that's been done on how you reach those people show that whatever message you present them with makes them more apprehensive. So, yeah, I mean, I'm not unduly troubled by the present situation. It's going to take a while to get all these vaccines out there.
One final very quick question from people who are watching. This is from Tim Spring, who is a lawyer. And I think this is directly in relation to the book. Were you ever threatened with legal proceedings, injunction or otherwise, by those involved who may have had an interest in this story not being told?
Wakefield has sued me 4 times, 2 of which got to court, one in London where the judge said it's being brought for public relations purposes, and Wakefield abandoned it after a year of discovery. Very valuable, biggest mistake of his life. He then sued again in Texas, and Tim will enjoy this one because the documents which were disclosed in the UK litigation, in the English litigation, I couldn't use them after he discontinued. I couldn't use them, but he then sued again in Texas, and so we moved over the documents, and in Texas they then became unsealed. So that the book actually contains documents that had he not sued in Texas, which he lost again on jurisdictional grounds, because, why is he suing me in Texas? And so those documents then are in the book, and, biggest mistake of his life. But yeah, I've spent more time on litigation than I have in writing stories. Been a massive activity. Right. He definitely didn't want us to tell this story.
Brian, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. I could sit here all afternoon, as I said, and ask you a million more questions, but I'm sure that we can do that later on today. Thank you again.
Thank you, Ava.
Thank you.
Enjoyed it.